The most widely accepted part of the life of Jesus is Jesus the teacher. The teaching of Jesus is woven into the fabric of our conversation. People say he's the salt of the earth. Love thy neighbor. Be a good Samaritan. He's a prodigal son. Judge not lest you be judged. You cast the first stone. Just go the extra mile. And people say this: I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher. There are not many people that disagree with that. Hey, this is Dan Arsenault. Welcome to Church for Skeptics. The teaching of Jesus is woven into the fabric of our conversation. I have a list here, a short list of things that we use in our conversations. There was a guy who said that he based his life on the sayings of John F. Kennedy, the president. And one of the things that he liked about John F. Kennedy was when John F. Kennedy said, "To whom much is given shall be much required." He didn't understand that John F. Kennedy, JFK, got it from Jesus, along with all these other sayings. People say he's the salt of the earth. People say, love thy neighbor. People say, do unto others. And they just shorten it. They know what they mean. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule, which, by the way, is an elevated, there's no other culture that says that. Confucius says, don't harm other people. Don't do unto them what you would not want done to me. But Jesus elevates that. We're going to come back to that too. But anyway, the golden rule is attributed to Jesus, of course. Be a good Samaritan, people say. He's a prodigal son, people say. He's the blind leading the blind. Apropos for our culture today. Judge not lest you be judged. Live by the sword, you fill in these blanks. Die by the sword, of course. He's a wolf in, fill in the blank, sheep's clothing. You cast the first stone. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. I think that's in a Dave Matthews song, actually. It's a sign of the times. And then my final one here, just on this short list, just go the extra mile. All those, of course, are attributed from the teaching of Jesus. Now, while it is true, and I want to give credit where credit is due, Western civilization is based upon the teaching of Judaism. Things like, and I've got another short list here, sanctity of life comes from Judaism, and really not from other cultures. Justice, a Judaic idea, equal rights. This is Old Testament now. This is what we would call Old Testament. They would call it the Torah. But it's immigrants have equal rights. Rich and poor have equal rights. Women have equal rights. And so all these things come from Judaism. Importance of family. It comes from Judaism. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Honor your father and mother. But while all those things are grounded in Judaism, Judaism was not the one to make Western civilization. It was Jesus. Because Jesus he's a Jewish rabbi after all, right? He takes those truths that are eternal, but especially from the Torah, and then because Jesus is the most influential person that ever lived, they become influential in Western civilization. I don't think you'd get a lot of pushback from historians or sociologists for that matter. But Jesus wasn't condemned for the golden rule. And this is important. We're talking about Jesus historically being a teacher, a very unique teacher. And that, part of the reason that his teaching is the most widely acclaimed thing about his life. And people say this: I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher. There are not many people that disagree with that. They also don't disagree that he was humble and meek and gentle and lowly in spirit. And he says that about himself, and we agree with him despite the fact that he was crucified for blasphemy. I think this is remarkable here. Mark chapter 14, this is the trial of Jesus. He's not on trial here for the golden rule. He's not on trial here for his stand on divorce. He's not on trial here for any of these things. He's not on trial for the Sermon on the Mount. Here's what he's on trial for. Mark chapter 14, I'll start in second part of verse, I'll start in 61. But Jesus remained silent at this point. This is also important here. We took Bart Ehrman to task in an earlier video about this. But the point here is Jesus was silent about his accusers, but he was not silent about his identity. And when it comes to his identity, that's what caused him to be crucified. So here it says, the high priest, but Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am." That's the name of God, said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." All three of those statements by Jesus are statements of deity, especially from a Hebrew perspective here. And that's why the next verse says the high priest tore his clothes, which was unheard of. It was not allowed to be done, even except an exception of the high priest, because his clothes are sacred. And so if he's going to tear those, it'd have to be in the presence of blasphemy, and that's exactly what he says. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to death. So Jesus really sentenced himself in that sense. He didn't sentence himself, but he became guilty of being who he is, of course, in our view. C.S. Lewis has a great comment, and I hesitate to read too much for you here, but this is from Mere Christianity. You've got to read this book. If you're a believer or not, you ought to read this book. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. He says, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." Now, here's what Lewis says. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said, and I'll parenthetically say about himself, would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says that he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Now, this is Lewis' statement, but I would agree with it and pass it on to you. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. That's what I did a long time ago. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to do that. So that's the first part of Jesus as a teacher here is his identity. He's teaching, I would say this, his primary teaching is not the golden rule, it's his own identity. Now, because of that, I want to try to connect what C.S. Lewis said to the uniqueness of Jesus' teaching. And to do that, we're going to go to the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to read the Sermon on the Mount to you. It's Matthew 5 through 7. If you care to read it, I encourage you to do that. Just from an historical standpoint, though, just leave Christianity out of it in that sense. Just let's do history here. There were other people who recognized the uniqueness and the influence of the teaching of Jesus. Shortly after 70 A.D., which was when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans and the temple, and shortly after that, there was a guy named Mara bar Serapion. Mara bar Serapion. He was a Stoic philosopher, and certainly not a Christian. He was in prison for his teaching, and he was writing a letter to his son. in which he says, and I'm not going to read the whole letter, I'm just going to paraphrase it. He said that all societies that have put to death their own wise teachers have come to ruin. And his examples of that, I think he wants to include himself as being a wise teacher, but his examples of that in history are Socrates, Pythagoras, and Jesus. And that's what he says. Their city and their temple came to ruin shortly after they put to death their wise, and he even calls him the wise king. Even the Talmud, and I know this is a little bit controversial, but I want to put it in here because it's enemy attestation. If your enemy agree with you, it's historical. So on the Talmud, which is a commentary, and it's considered sacred, a rabbinical commentary on the Old Testament and about Jewish times, here's what the Talmud said. It says that Jesus, or somebody named Yeshua, who else could it be? He deserved his punishment because he practiced sorcery, there's your miracle worker, and he led Israel astray. And there's your teaching, the power of his teaching. Now, unfortunately, so-called Christians at one point wanted to blame the whole idea on Judaism itself, the whole idea of his crucifixion. And of course, they use these Talmudic verses to demonstrate that. Even Martin Luther was not very Christian in his treatment and exchanges with the Jewish people. And I'm sorry about that. That should not be the case. But my big point here, the point I want to finish with this, Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. Number one, Jesus very much endorses Judaism in the Old Testament. He is a Jewish rabbi first and foremost. And he says, I've not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. That's Matthew 5:17 rather. But then after that, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addressed, oh man, get this. This is fantastic, I think. He addresses murder. He addresses adultery. He addresses divorce. He addresses swearing oaths, which was a big deal in those days. He addresses justice. And in every case, here's what he says. He says this, you have heard that it was said. He's quoting Old Testament. He's quoting what he attributes to be the Word of God. And then he's adding to it or even trumping over it a little bit. Here's what I say. Jesus, in his grace, ended the death penalty for those who believe because he died for our sins. He ended the death penalty against us breaking the law, which we all do, of course. Even if you summarize the law into the two that Jesus summarized, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. We can't do that. We don't do it. We like it, but we can't do it. So grace, the fact that Jesus died for us, he ends the death penalty. At the same time, that same grace intensifies the standard, the moral standard. And so here's what he says. You have said, I'll get back here. You said, you shall not murder. I say, if you hate your brother without a cause, you're guilty of the same thing. You're like in the shallow end of the same pool. The big thing about this is that at the end of this, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, let me read you two quick verses here. Chapter 7, verse 28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Rabbinical teachers in those days, and still these days, they would quote other like precedent, like they do in court. But Jesus didn't do that. He said, here's the precedent, but I'm adding to it. I'm intensifying this standard. I'm elevating the moral standard from murder to hatred, from adultery to lust, from swearing to just keeping your promise. You see that? He's teaching as if he is God in the flesh. And I think that's why his teaching is so influential, of course. It's the way to live. It's the way to live. Thanks for watching.